It's nice to see you.
Hi, Katya. Hi, Andy. Welcome.
Hey, Wayne. Thanks.
And now let's give, just a few minutes for people to join us, and then we'll be ready to start.
So Katya, if you want to go ahead, please, maybe.
Yes, I think we can get started. I mean, there are some people probably still joining us, but let me start by saying it's a pleasure to have Andy Zeitlin from Georgetown here with us for the last NOVAFRICA webinar of the semester. So let's hope that we restart in the face-to-face format when we resume. But it's a real pleasure then to have Andy today telling us about this work on benchmarking a child nutrition program against cash and evidence from Rwanda. So whenever you're ready, Andy, the floor is yours.
Terrific. Thank you so much for having me. I only regret that I'm not able to be there in person this time around, and I guess I'm especially appreciative for the invitation, given that we were intending to do this in the fall, and in addition to the human disaster unfolding around us, there was also the natural disaster of a power outage on my part of the East Coast that made that problematic. So really appreciative of the chance to reschedule. So what I want to talk about with you all and look forward to your feedback on today is a project that I've been working on. It's actually one of a series of sister projects that I've been working on for some time with Craig McIntosh at UCSD. And these experiments are investigating what you might think of as a kind of, sort of existential question, the kind of thing that, keeps college students and maybe even some aid workers up late at night as they sort of think about the value added by the programs that in government or in aid in particular we put forward and administer. And so that very basic question that these studies are seeking to speak to is the question of whether the kind of complex in-kind systems of benefits that governments often provide are the best way to deliver benefits to the populations that they seek to help, or might it be the case that beneficiaries would be better off if instead they just simply received the money in the cheapest way that this could be done, right? And when you think about sort of why one might be interested in providing in-kind benefits versus providing benefits in cash, I think there's a couple pieces of the argument which I'll just sort of briefly summarize on each side, right? So when you think about the argument for in-kind interventions, we think typically these will rest on the existence of some form of market failure, right? So in some sense you have to believe in the existence of some form of market failure for an in-kind intervention to make sense at all, but it's not a novel argument among development economists to think that market failures might be present and potentially important, and so real and meaningful drivers of kind of program choice. On the other hand, to the extent that we think that cash has an important case to be made, this typically relies on the idea that there are liquidity constraints. So people are not able to borrow to finance the kinds of projects that cash would enable. And so there's a role for government in solving that liquidity problem, leaving aside kind of international transfers, although that would also weigh in. And then when we think about specifically the modality, that individuals' knowledge of their own preferences and opportunities allow them to do things which are good for them in a way that brings benefits that outweigh the kinds of constraints posed by market failures, whether those market failures are of the internalities type, so of the sort that people don't do what is best for their long run selves, or whether those market failures are of the kind of externalities type, that the consumption decisions of individuals or the expenditure decisions of individuals might be bad for those around them, particularly people who are not targeted by cash or in-kind programs. And similarly, when we think about sort of market imperfections here too, I think you want to think about market power as an important determinant of the relative merits of cash, to the extent that whether benefits will stick to beneficiaries or be passed through to the suppliers of the goods that they consume in the form of higher prices is an important consideration and limitation in a variety of settings. So, in fact, when you think about the kind of arguments on both sides, I think there's, you can make a case either way, and a lot is going to depend on the details of specific interventions and the specific context in which they are instituted, as far as whether these are going to, whether sort of cash or kind will deliver the greatest benefit in economic welfare terms.
And can I interrupt already?
Yes, please.
I was just thinking about it, and I understand your point, obviously. I was just thinking that from the donor point of view, there could also be some kind of like political economy considerations, in the sense that maybe the donor will get more support if it delivers in kind, okay, versus cash, because there could be some sort of paternalism on the part of of those supporting or not these donors. So, I know it's not the same question that you were saying, but we're talking, and I was thinking about these kind of constraints that these donors could be facing. So
I think that's an important point, right? So I think one aspect of that you hear a lot about in kind of personal giving, but also kind of, we might aggregate this up to think about what do people think about, aid budgets and the like, right? Is the concern that, even if they are wrong to be so, that the kind of, let's take, this is USAID. So if the US population thinks that you can't trust people in Rwanda, which is where we'll be studying, to spend money wisely, then the overall aid budget might be a function of the modality. I think that's certainly
precisely
consideration. To the extent that we want to speak not only to donor-financed kind of international aid, but also that this is a framework that in principle could be applied to domestically funded programs as well, to think about what are the best ways to deliver benefits. There you might think, there are certainly political economy considerations that could enter that as well, either in the form of that kind of paternalism, right? So, cash welfare in the United States for domestic giving is kind of limited by these same, to stick with that example, is limited by these same kinds of considerations. And, there are potentially political economy consequences of the goods that you deliver as a government, and cash might differ in its visibility from, a cow or whatever it might be that you can kind of point to and say, that's the cow that I got from the government. So, I certainly agree that all those considerations are there when we think about what's the full political economy of the decisions that go into delivering these. Here, I think we sort of see our role in this instance as speaking more narrowly to the question of economic welfare, taking the overall budget as fixed, and that maybe part of what researchers can do is move the needle on what to even maybe just a little bit on what do on the political economy, right? That we don't have to take that as given, but to the extent that evidence emerges that cash is not just spent on sin goods or things like that, that might change those constraints to some extent. But it's a very good point, for sure. And so I think, you know, this question, or the relevance of in particular unconditional cash transfers, and in particular has kind of risen in salience, especially since arguments made by Chris Blattman and Paul Niehaus at an early stage that this that we might think of cash as playing a role that's sort of analogous to an index fund in you know, in the mutual funds space, right? That this sort of puts the onus on, or in the same way that in the presence of low-cost index funds puts the onus on mutual fund managers to show that they deliver value that kind of beats the market. So too, you might think that the presence of cash transfers as a kind of low-cost default alternative could put political pressure on the designers of programs and the implementers of programs to show that they can overcome you know, a kind of cost-benefit hurdle that makes it worth kind of paying what will typically, but not always, be the higher overheads associated with their programs. And so, you know, I think this is a really appealing idea, as we'll see, and I think it's an idea that becomes all the more appealing when you think of the kind of reduced costs associated with mobile transfers, as you know, this audience knows very well, right? And so the rise in mobile money makes possible these kinds of transfer systems in low-cost ways that make that not just a kind of casual thought experiment, but especially as we've seen in the pandemic era, a viable alternative to delivering aid in consequences where, or social support in consequences where in circumstances where that might otherwise be difficult. So I think that's a real and interesting possibility to consider. I think that when we think about this index fund analogy, it's sort of limited, and we'll talk about this as we go along, but that you start to run up against the boundaries of how far you can stretch that analogy once you start to think about the multidimensional nature of what a lot of programs seek to do, right? And so it's one thing to say that my my mutual fund beats the market or it doesn't, when it's clear what the goal of that fund is. It's a little bit harder to say that you are going to have, in a sense that everyone would agree, that you're going to have a program that beats cash or doesn't, when the outcomes are various, and where cash typically is you would expect is going to have outcomes that are diffuse across a range of ways that people might spend that to increase their own welfare, whereas in-kind programs are typically, but not always, you might start from the view that they're going to have quite concentrated impacts on a narrower set of outcomes that are closely tied to the specific benefits that are delivered. So, I think we'll have to think about how to weigh those trade-offs across these different outcome dimensions. I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go along. But, however you want to think about the policymaker's problem, one thing that I think has become really apparent as we start to have, a greater body of evidence around the challenges of extrapolating results from one context to another, is that contextual effects matter so much for, or so strong as determinants of program benefits, that being able to hold two things up kind of head to head in the same contextual context, as opposed to relying on meta-analyses that look at cash in a variety of contexts, look at in-kind in a variety of contexts, and then try to match those on some observable features or think about comparability, that this is a way to get a kind of strong counterfactual for the relative merits of two different modalities in a way that is more difficult to sort of build up from meta-analyses of separately implemented randomized controlled trials or other forms of evidence. Okay, and so we're gonna kind of take this problem on in this paper in the context of health, and in particular nutritional and maternal health in Rwanda, and we think this is a pretty good place to be kind of trying out some of these ideas. first of all, on the grounds that this is a pretty important problem and a pretty important problem in the context in which we're working. So the districts in which we work in Rwanda, these are primarily rural districts, and they're going to feature under 5 stunting rates in the kind of mid 30s to mid 40% of children. So, these are contexts where the where sort of nutritional and health outcomes are not great for young kids, in spite of a lot of the progress that Rwanda has made on child health over the last 20 years. And they kind of span the range. They're sort of neither the worst nor the very best performing districts in Rwanda in that regard. So I think, context-wise, this is a sort of reasonable representation of a context in which this kind of programming is, and this policy problem is fairly urgent. The multidimensional health programming that we're going to study, this kind of bundled package, this is also really typical of what you will see at organizations like USAID. It's been advocated by public health experts in the kind of biggest platforms. And it's been found programs like this, although with some important distinctions, but programs like this have been found to have positive effects in neighboring countries like Burundi and Kenya. So, this is a sort of an area where there seems to be a good case for this type of intervention. There's certainly a lot of money being thrown at this kind of intervention. Whether it's doing the most that money could be doing or not is an open question. And it's an open question in part because we are starting to see some evidence, or there is some evidence, that cash transfers can move the kinds of child health outcomes and nutritional outcomes that are the object of this type of intervention as well. Right? So you would sort of be a little bit wary of, or it would be harder to sort of do this kind of head-to-head in a context where the types of outcomes that you might think cash could plausibly move are very different than program objectives, and you would start with a kind of a fundamental misalignment in what the designers of the program care about. Here, even on its own terms, there's the prospect that cash might move the kinds of outcomes that program designers care about in a cost-effective way. Okay. So what we're going to do then in this paper, just to kind of give you a sense of what's coming, is we are going to conduct a cluster randomized trial. We work in 248 villages in Rwanda, and we're going to enroll in the program households containing pregnant women or children in the first 1,000 days of life. Those, and there's a large literature to sort of suggest those are sort of program eligibility criteria. There's large literature to suggest why there was this focus on the first 1,000 days in the program. We'll also have a sample of ineligible households in the same villages to be able to look at kind of spillover effects and the like. And then the villages will be allocated at a high level either to Gikuriro, the in-kind program, to cash, or to control. And then within the cash arm, we've got some experimental variations, the role of which I'll lay out as we go along. But we're among, and perhaps most importantly among them, we're going to vary the transfer amounts. And we're going to do so in a way that allows us, after the fact, to go in and cost the in-kind program, and then through a regression adjustment that I'll explain, to line up or to kind of estimate counterfactual impacts of cash if you spent exactly the same amount as you spend on the in-kind program in kind of dollars out the door from the donor's perspective. And so that's going to be sort of important, and also will allow us to estimate the return to the marginal dollar, so we can learn some extra lessons from that. We'll also think about variation in timing, and I'll talk about the implications of that to the extent that that might be an important driver of why cash does or does not have impacts. Okay, so this basic design then is going to allow us to talk about a couple of different kinds of trade-offs. And I want to kind of highlight 3 as we think about what is the kind of sort of framework that we will take to interpreting these results, right? So the first of those kinds of trade-offs is across outcomes. So as I alluded to already, we're going to see impacts of cash and on kind on different outcomes, and we would not expect, and indeed we will not find, that one of those is going to dominate the other across all outcomes when we compare them at cost equivalent levels. So it's going to be hard to declare a single winner, but instead what this kind of apparatus is going to allow policymakers to do is to say statements like, if you move from in-kind into cash, you're going to give up X amount in the impacts on savings, and you're going to generate this amount in the impacts on consumption. And policymaker preferences, or ultimately perhaps beneficiary preferences, will be the kind of guide to whether those trade-offs are worth it or not. So that trade-off across outcomes is going to be particularly important as we think about the alternative modalities. The variation in cash transfer size allows us to get at another dimension of trade-offs, which is the intensity of intervention, right? So for a given budget, you could spend a lot on a small number of people and leave a lot of people untreated, or you could spend a smaller amount on a wider array of people and leave fewer people untreated. One of the nice things about cash as a potential intervention is the ease with which it can be ratcheted up or down, right? It's not so lumpy as in-kind interventions that are what they are. And so we can think about, this other dimension that policymakers weigh, which is less about cash versus kind per se, and more about the kind of intensity versus diffusion of a given budget as something that you could deliver. Typically our RCTs are set up to tell us something about, additive welfare, or give us something that is kind of the answer that an additive, a social planner with an additive welfare function would want to see. So we can think about kind of in cost benefit terms, what would that look like? And then lastly, when we think about kind of the dimensions of trade-offs that we're going to get at here, we can also think about trade-offs across different subpopulations, right? So, that comes in a couple of different forms, one of which is about kind of targeted eligible beneficiaries or targeted populations versus non-targeted populations, right? And so should the ineligibles be given 0 welfare weight, or should we kind of incorporate their welfare in some way? Depending on what relative weight we want to put on kind of targeted populations versus the general population, we might come to a different conclusion about the relative merits of different programs. But then even among the eligibles, right, they vary in observable ways, and we might have welfare weights that are not the same that we would apply to different members of the eligible population. So we can think about heterogeneity amongst eligibles as a way to think about in the relative returns of cash and kind, as a way to think about who is benefiting the most and who is potentially hurt by your decision to shift from one form of modality to another. And a kind of perhaps interesting kind of experiment that we can layer onto that is to ask the question of, given the possibility of heterogeneous relative returns to cash and kind, is it possible that you could find target interventions in a way that would kind of expand the envelope of what you can achieve in welfare terms by giving people what it appears is best for them on average in the basis of some set of observable characteristics? So we'll look at that kind of fine targeting question as well. Okay, so then going forward, so let me tell you a bit about the study design. I'll talk about the comparative impacts. We'll talk about this heterogeneity question. Time permitting, I can talk a bit about program rigidity and choice, which we get at with this timing experiment, and then conclude. Okay, so then to talk about the specifics of the design. So Gikariro, the in-kind program that we study, it's a USAID-sponsored integrated nutrition and WASH program. It targets pregnant women and children in the first 1,000 days of life. And you should think of this as doing kind of 4 main things. First, it has village nutrition schools, and we want you to kind of think about, in relative terms also, like where's the money flowing as some measure of the emphasis of each of these things. So it has village nutrition schools, which absorb about 19% of the budget to deliver. And these are really focused on remembering that Rwanda is quite a high population density country. These are really focused on encouraging households to grow things with high micronutrient values in very small areas, including, like backyard plots or even growing things in sacks and the like. So technologies for helping to increase the nutrient value of the household's diet in ways that are really kind of achievable on a small scale is the focus of these particular village nutrition schools. Second piece of,
sorry,
yes,
just a clarification. So these demonstration plots, how are they implemented? Is this, how do people, I mean, do people just sit and observe? They don't really try it on their own plots, or how does it work?
There's some small amount of seed disbursement that allows people to carry these out on their own as well. I think, I guess I don't have the number on here. The total value of kind of physical goods dispersed to beneficiaries in this program is only about 5% of its operating budget. And so you shouldn't think of this as, you know, large scale distribution of seeds and fertilizers and things like that. But there are kind of, from a demonstration perspective, there are some seeds that are delivered there. That ties into the farmer field learning schools. And part of what's going on here is there's a bit of heterogeneity across context. So the goal is to be a bit adaptive to what's possible and needed in particular contexts. So there's so these are small scale showcases in the school piece, but then there's the kind of field learning bit where farmers do more on their own. And that includes seeds making possible the micronutrient piece, but also small scale distribution of small livestock and poultry. And again, this is pretty small, right? So think of this as comprising just 5% of the budget in terms of the goods dispersed through the school, even though the school itself is kind of a substantial piece of the intervention. They also encourage savings through these silks, savings in internal lending communities. In monetary terms, that doesn't cost a lot, but in program emphasis terms, that's going to be important, and you'll see that turn up in the savings impacts of this program. And then finally, they also kind of tie into a government-sponsored program, a community-based environmental health promotion program. This is basically WASH, so sanitation and hygiene practices promoted by community health workers, and ties into a government initiative along those lines. Across all these, there's some, if you're sort of thinking about where in total does the money go here, there's some routine M&E, which is not about evaluating relative impacts, but is part and parcel of the delivery of the program. And then there's some behavioral change stuff, which is mostly about trying to get people into these activities layered on top of the cost. Okay, so that's the in-kind piece. The unconditional cash transfers are provided by Give Directly here, and with transfer amounts that are randomized at the village level. The lump sum, what we'll call, so there are going to be two modalities here: a lump sum transfer, which is 2 tranches early on in the intervention, and then there are flow transfers, which are monthly over the duration of the study period, ending just before the end line here. These are unconditional transfers, but there's one small nudge involved here, which is at the outset of the program, there's a flyer distributed in Give Directly villages that encourages households to think about the possibilities of improving nutritional outcomes. Okay, so then a main goal from a kind of study design perspective here, an important goal for us is to think about not just making comparisons in terms of cost-benefit ratios, which sometimes may be a little bit misleading in the sense that they imply the kind of linear scalability of that cost-benefit ratio to whatever level you might consider. Whereas a policymaker who's contemplating taking their $200 a head in-kind program and converting it to cash might really want to know, at exactly that level, if I want to kind of be procedurally equivalent and deliver the same amount on average per beneficiary, then how can I do that in kind of a cost equivalent way? So we want to allow for the possibility that the benefits of cash are not linear in the transfer amounts, and make state comparisons specifically to the level of cash that is equivalent in dollars out of the donor's hand to the in-kind study. And so we do this in 2 steps. The first step is to try to figure out before the fact what Gikariro is going to cost, and an ex-ante costing exercise for the village assignable components of the program. I should be careful to say there are other things that Gikariro does that are kind of advocacy or at kind of the meta level, and that's all outside of the costs and also kind of context for the benefits, but not directly evaluated here. So those costs come in at ex ante at $119 per eligible household in Gikariro. That was our sort of before the fact estimate. And given that, we allocate the cash transfer villages, the give directly villages, to either be in a range of values designed to bracket that projected cost ex ante. So the big problem here is trying to think about how before the fact can you set up a study to deliver cost equivalent results after the fact when there is uncertainty ex ante in what costs are actually going to be. So we bracket the projected value high and low, and we do that in dollars into kind of the give directly pot per beneficiary. That implies different things in terms of what beneficiaries will actually receive, because there are some fixed costs of delivery as well as variable costs. So that's why you see, for instance, here that the actual transfer values are quite a bit less, especially at small transfers where the fixed cost of delivery will matter more. And then we, in addition to that, have a large transfer arm, which is $567 per beneficiary in dollars out the door, which is about $517 in projected transfer value. And all of these costs are based on a synthetic scale up. So a convenient feature of cash is that it's pretty easy to figure out what the production function looks like for the delivery of cash. And so we can not just think about cash being delivered at the scale of our experiment, but we want to kind of keep the playing field level here. And Gikariro is a multi-district nationwide program being run over 5 years. And so its fixed costs are amortized over a much larger beneficiary population. So in order to keep the playing field level, we similarly, but synthetically, scale up what Give Directly would do to sort of approximate its costs at a comparable scale to the Gikariro program. Okay, so what does that give us in terms of the assignment of households to treatments here? So we've got 74 villages allocated to control, 74 to Gikariro, and then a range of villages allocated to each of the kind of bracketing transfer values, and then 34 villages allocated to the large transfer exceeding $500 in dollars out the door. In each of those villages, we have a sample of eligible and ineligible households as defined by the criteria I said. As I'll talk about, there are one concern here is these are ex ante definition, or these are kind of survey-based definitions of eligibility. Part of the consultative process of the in-kind program is going to be to go around and kind of reassess this. And so not everybody who we think should get treated ends up getting treated. And we'll deal with that by thinking about kind of ITT estimates and adjusting costs to allow for non-compliance. And then among the eligible households, we then have a randomization to either flow transfers, which are the majority, lump sum transfers, which are a smaller share here, and then a small number of households that are randomly assigned to get their choice between the two. And that's part of a revealed preference exercise that's going to allow everybody to say kind of what their preference would be in the cash transfer villages between lump sum and flow transfers, and to think about kind of what we can learn from people's preferences about the relative about potential targeting mechanisms or the constraints to the benefits that cash may deliver.
Just one question.
Please.
Can you clarify how these transfers are different to the setting of Give Directly in Kenya? So is this large transfer similar to what they give there, or?
Yeah, so in amount and in modality, the larger transfer is pretty comparable to what Give Directly does in Kenya in the House Offer All study, for instance, in the sort of $500 range. The bracketing transfers are smaller than is typical of Give Directly's programming. And that's going to be important, I think, across the board. As you'll see, we're going to see pretty modest, quite modest effects of everything at the level, at the kind of cost equivalent level. And so, part of what happens here is that Gikariro turns out to be quite cheap per household, even relative to other programs in this nutritional space. And after the fact, it seems that one piece of that is that compared to some other implementations of similar bundled nutrition and hygiene programs in neighboring countries, it doesn't have direct nutritional supplementation as a part of the sort of bundle. So they're not like delivering food, they're delivering the means and knowledge to make better food. But that keeps its costs down. It also means that the bracketing and transfer, the cash transfer, is sort of relatively inexpensive. Given the evaluation window here, which is going to be over a year, it also limits the benefits of Gikariro for kind of obvious reasons, and so that's going to be important to keep in mind. But in terms of modalities, I would say that the way that cash is delivered is similar to how Give Directly does it in other countries, and subsequently in Rwanda as well. And in terms of both its sort of flow modality and its lump sum modality, those are pretty typical of alternatives that they use. The targeting is perhaps the most different feature of this, in that you've seen kind of proxy means tested allocations from Give Directly in the Kenya work. In Rwanda, that's not going to be the case, although all of the eligibility takes place within a government proxy means tested criteria. So the government of Rwanda has sort of a set of wealth criteria called Ubudehe, that of which there are 4. Eligible households come from the bottom 2 here only, and so the only thing that's different is the need to target pregnant and pregnant women and young children within those categories. But in subsequent work, I think in Rwanda, in subsequent operational work, I believe that they're using the same Ubudehe criteria as the basis for targeting at scale. Thanks for that.
Andrew, can I ask a question?
Please.
So in the non-cash program, so the health program, do you have a sense of whether people could, whether these benefits could be made fungible, so whether people could actually sell things out of it, and whether, how much would be that? And second, so I wasn't 100% clear. So in terms of, so what is most comparable here between the 2 programs? So we now have a sense about the costs, the exposed cost of the health program, and what is then the cost that is closest with respect to the cash, accounting, of course, also for the donor costs. Because
yeah,
what you're telling us here is the money in hand, if I understand it.
Actually, these numbers are the ex ante costs out of the donor's hand, and the transfers are projected to be about 80% of that, roughly on average, which varies depending on the scale of the benefit delivered. And I'll talk about the ex post costs and be more precise there after the fact, because for both programs, the actual cost of delivery are going to be slightly different than what they were projected to be. In Gikariro, that arises in part because compliance is a little bit lower than expected, and so that's going to be kind of perhaps one driver there. But in terms of fungibility, I would think this is mostly a program where the benefits of the in-kind program are non-fungible, because the actual goods and services, the actual physical goods delivered are such a small component of the program, right? So Gikariro is going to end up costing about $140 out of the donor's hand per beneficiary, and the physical resources transferred are about 5% of that. So this is not a lot if you're going to think about kind of reselling the benefits there. Mostly these are things that stick to the beneficiaries because they're in the, to the extent that they participate, because they're in the form of kind of knowledge or the like. They're also kind of saturating. So our sample is a subset of the village, but it's probably also to say they are targeting everybody in the village with the intervention, all eligible households, and similarly, actually Give Directly is then targeting everybody in the village, not just our sample. and both implementers are blinded to our sample within the eligibles, and so ought not to be able to kind of finally target towards them. But that will also kind of reduce the scope for transfers to the extent that everybody's getting the same thing that you're getting as well, at least among the eligibles. Okay. After the fact, costs look a little bit different. So the cost, so this gets, I think, Pedro, to your question. So the costs to USAID per beneficiary turn out to be about $141 per eligible, per beneficiary, excuse me, in Gikuriro. This arises in part because the compliance rate among eligibles is lower than projected. And here, where that lower compliance is coming from is from the kind of reclassification, actually in all arms, is coming from the NGOs reclassifying individuals on the basis of their kind of perceived eligibility. So, they get there on the ground, they check Budehe status, they check kind of children in the household and the like, and they reclassify households that way. So that's the reason why the kind of cost per actual beneficiary is lower than the kind of cost per eligible as defined by our sample here. And so we end up then, as a consequence of that, having kind of the benchmark amount falling kind of toward the upper end of our bracketed range. And you want to think about that when you think about kind of how we, the regression adjustments that we're going to make as we go along. And so similarly, kind of, also with cash, right? Compliance is not people turning down cash here. Compliance is kind of relative to the sample defined eligibles, whether they're actually being kind of treated by the implementers as a sort of supply side constraint rather than demand side. Okay, so let me then start kind of taking you through some of the impacts of the programs. And I want to start just by laying out kind of the simple reduced form ITT in kind of traditional form. And then given that given that our bracketing cash transfer amounts or the actual cost of Gikuriro is sort of at the high end of those bracketing amounts, our kind of pre-specified pooled analysis of the bracketed amounts is maybe not the best direct comparator in terms of the cost equivalent comparison. So sort of the centerpiece here is going to be the kind of regression adjusted analysis that tries to exactly hold constant the ex post costs out the door across these two programs, which I'll come to second. So to take you through kind of the ITT results then here, so I think the biggest kind of takeaway. So we've got a range of kind of pre-specified primary outcomes. Some of these are at the household level, where we're looking at consumption, dietary diversity, and non-land wealth. And then we've got a bunch of individual outcomes, which are mostly but not exclusively child level outcomes, right? The exception there is maternal anemia down here at the bottom. Is the only kind of mother level outcome here. But we've got kind of child length or child growth outcomes in the sample here. So each of these rows represents a separate regression on the relevant outcome. And then we are going to adjust, we're going to present Anderson sharpened Q values. That's what you see in the brackets to adjust at the kind of family level. So all the household things or all the individual things, that'll be the basis for kind of claims of statistical significance here. Yes. So I think, the first thing you probably want to take away here is that, and relates back to this question of kind of the resource intensity of Gikuriro as a program, is that this program, is perhaps just not delivering enough value, to really move, especially child growth outcomes over a 12-month span. And so, we don't see any impacts of Gikuriro on the kind of child growth outcomes that we care about here relative to control over this sort of 9 months of exposure, 12 months post-baseline that they implement in. Some of that is about the timeliness of rollout, right? So one feature of cash is that cash gets there quickly. And Gikuriro, maybe if you think this is going to do some good, maybe Gikuriro, because there are some small front-end delays in their delivery, maybe that's a reason why kind of benefits are slow to mature there. But I think a motive, the kind of animating motivation for this program was to reach children in this critical window in the first 1,000 days. And so, this is over a kind of 9 months of exposure, 12 months since baseline. That's the sort of window that they care about is passing by, as this program is not really delivering benefits, at least on these kinds of primary outcomes. The same is true of cash, dispersed over such a large period of time, let me say that differently. The cash intervention is also fairly light relative to kind of the 12 months of exposure here. So a first takeaway is that you may just need more resource intensity to dramatically move the needle on a lot of these outcomes, especially the child growth outcomes. And there's a demonstration of that in the Give Directly large arm, which is transferring a little more than $500 to beneficiaries, right? Which we can see does substantially move the needle on consumption. So these are the consumption variable is in you can interpret that as about a 30% increase in household consumption, about a 0.5 unit increase in the standard instrument of the household dietary diversity score, which is pretty substantial relative to the kind of amount of variation in that. And even, what I think the kind of public health literature would think of as, modest, but over this time frame, not trivial, or not totally negligible impacts on child growth. So we see that across height for age z-scores, weight for age z-scores, and even MUAC, the mid-upper arm circumference. So larger cash transfers seem to be doing a bit of good here, but on the primary outcomes, the smaller transfers don't move the needle very much, whether in cash or in kind. When we turn to secondary outcomes, we do see some interesting movement, even from the smaller transfers, in ways that I think speaks interestingly to the kind of both program design and the kinds of things that households are doing with the money, right? So households receiving the smaller transfers, for instance, are substantially paying down debt. On the other side, in Gikuriro, remember the savings vehicle that is a component of that intervention. You see quite substantial increases in household savings arising from that. Give Directly households are accumulating both productive and consumption assets. And then those sort of effects are even larger when we turn to think about kind of the big transfers, right, where the effects are on these kinds of secondary outcomes are even more pronounced. So we do see sort of interesting and differential patterns of movement in these secondary household level outcomes. At the child level or at the individual level, when we try to dig a little bit deeper into some of these things, we don't see too much more going on, except perhaps interestingly, a reduction, a small reduction, but against a low base in child mortality turning up from the large transfers there. Interestingly, I guess, beyond that, I would say, some of the other things like vaccination take up, which were part of the kind of broader set of communicated materials, don't seem to move very much, nor do we see kind of evidence of movement on disease prevalence that would respond to the water and sanitation and hygiene components of the Gikuriro intervention there as well. So that's sort of the sort of ITT results. What I think is kind of our main. Oh yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, just one question on the primary results, and especially on the results for the nutrition intervention. I think in the introduction you mentioned 2 studies that were similar, evaluating similar program that found positive effect. And how do you interpret it? Is it because they did more, like the program spent more, or maybe the time frame was different?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. We've thought a lot about this. So, for instance, the Kenya study, Null et al., which is in Lancet Global Health, that's a 2-year study, but they do show 1-year impacts that we would be powered to detect. They're sort of on the order of what we see in our Give Directly large arm. And so, it's not just the timeline, I think, and the relatively circumscribed, the fact that we've only got a year of kind of study duration here, that is responsible for the absence of effects there. Given that those other interventions do seem to move the needle within a 1-year time frame, with magnitudes that we would seem to be powered to detect. Rather, I think that it has more to do with the program design, or our kind of working hypothesis, but this is a bit speculative, is that this has something to do with the program design and the relative resource intensity and immediacy of those programs in a way that is a little bit missing from what we see in Gikuriro. And so when you kind of line up what this program does versus what those other programs do, there is some direct nutritional supplementation in the provision of actual food that comes in those other programs and that is not present in Gikuriro. And I think, when you look back on the study design, and we were really taking kind of, what USAID Rwanda was doing at scale, and it's just a small way of kind of washing our hands of this design choice. But, I think in hindsight, and this is certainly something that we have advocated after the fact, I think if we could change one thing about Gikuriro, I think we would, thinking about the outcomes it's trying to move and the time frame in which it's trying to move them, directly supplementing nutrition to make sure that you are getting benefits in the short run, as well as kind of planting the proverbial seeds of better nutritional outcomes in a slightly longer duration, seems like probably would be a good complement to the existing strategy. So I suspect it's at least in part that.
Okay, makes sense. Thanks.
But I guess our experimental results won't speak directly to that. Okay, so then our focus here and our kind of methodological contribution, in a sense, right, is to think about how can we line these comparisons up, right? Can we provide a framework not just for the evaluation of this program, but kind of in general, where donors or analysts who wanted to be able to to compare the benefits of in-kind versus cash programming would be able to do so at exact cost equivalent levels without having to make the kind of strong linearity or the particular form of strong linearity assumptions that are made in thinking that cost benefit ratios can be scaled up or down to match whatever resource intensity a donor wants to deliver at. And so we are going to do that not in an entirely assumption-free way, but because that forces us to move a little bit outside of the ITT. But I'll show you kind of that our framework allows us to think about the sensitivity of this to these kinds of assumptions. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to kind of estimate a specification that allows for, first of all, an indicator for whether you receive any treatment at all, and then an indicator for Gikuriro on top of that. So the coefficient on Gikuriro will now come to represent the differential effect of Gikuriro relative to exactly benchmarked cash. And the way we'll get that exactly benchmarked cash piece is through a regression adjustment that allows for the kind of linear, the departure from the exact benchmarked amount as this extra term. So that's what the tau C is going to be. So that's the marginal return to $1, centered on centering this on allowing us to center the direct effects of receiving any program on the exact benchmarked amount here. Okay, and then as in the other specifications, we've got a set of lasso selected controls and controls for baseline outcomes in this specification as well. Okay, so turning then to that kind of cost equivalent comparison. What we then see, so to focus your eyes first on the first column here, we do see that in spite of the limited impacts overall, there is actually, at least in the consumption domain, because Gikuriro actually marginally reduces consumption relative to control, and the small cash transfers actually increase consumption relative to control, that actually there is a wedge between what these two programs deliver on one of the primary outcomes, which is the consumption outcome. Right. And so you can read this as Gikuriro delivering about 20% lower consumption relative to the cash transfer alternative. So if that's the comparison that you're making, then actually rather than comparisons just to kind of doing nothing, then there are actually kind of meaningful differences in this space. And then what we're doing in this specification is linearizing the transfer value, the transfer costs, I should say. And so this 0.05 then represents kind of the marginal return to an additional $100 in transfer. In transfer in dollars out the door from USAID's terms. And you can see there again, kind of mirroring the ITT effects that, more money delivers better height for age, more money delivers more consumption and better household dietary diversity as well. I think I won't dwell too much on these others, which mostly mirror the ITT specifications in the interest of time, just to say that, we see on secondary outcomes, we see meaningful differences in terms of borrowing and savings, as you would expect. We see differences in sanitation practices, productive assets, consumption assets at the exact cost benchmark level here. Okay, so, and, I think maybe just to kind of step back and think about what we're learning from this, as we think about kind of the framework for thinking about how donors might make these kinds of comparisons, I think the basic idea is to consider between two alternatives here, right? What we're calling cost equivalence, which is in essence a kind of regression adjusted comparison, where what we're doing in effect, right? So sorry, this is a little cramped, but the gray circle here represents what's happening in the control, right? And then each of the black, green, and red circles, these represent the outcomes under each of the kind of bracketing costs for the cash transfers. The diamond is Gikariro here. And what we're doing in effect is linearizing the effects of the cash transfers using all the information in our sample in order to be able to make a direct comparison at exactly the cost equivalent level to what the Gikariro arm is doing, right? And so the circle here represents kind of, the at exactly that benchmark cost. What does our regression estimate imply is what cash would deliver at that level. And that's a in principle quite a different basis for comparison than the cost effectiveness comparison, where kind of cost effectiveness is potentially quite, cost effectiveness you can think of as instead being the kind of ratio of these benefits compared to control over the expenditure on each of these. So think of that as like the slope here, right? So to maximize cost effectiveness, you might look at this on consumption, you might think that actually the small transfer, marginally is the one with the highest slope here. So is the thing that's kind of doing the most good. And you can think about kind of comparison of the cost effectiveness ratio for any of the cash arms relative to the Gikariro arm as kind of presented kind of potential benefits there. Of course, to the extent that these relationships are not going to be linear, extrapolating cost effectiveness outside the support of any one of these things may be misleading. But of course, that's not to say that we aren't relying on linearity ourselves for our kind of interpolation of cash's impacts when we do the exact cost equivalence analysis here as well. But I think that's, what we want to kind of drive home is that these are pretty different ways of thinking about the relative returns of two different modalities. And that, if the counterfactual that a donor wants to consider is the counterfactual in which you would hold fixed the allocation per beneficiary, you say you're willing to spend $140 per person, you want to know what the best way to do that is. That's a very different question than thinking about kind of, in theory, what is the cost benefit maximizing way to allocate cash and hold that up against some in-kind program where the consequence of that would be that, if you went with, this cost of the small transfer, you would need to be doing that on, double the population that you do the in-kind transfer on in order to deliver kind of comparable magnitudes in total. Given that linearity that is involved in our cost equivalent specification, it's important, of course, for us to kind of think about to what extent does the way that we make that comparison matter for the results that we get. And so you can think about a variety of ways that you could do this. You don't have to make it linear. You could make it a quadratic or cubic or some higher order kind of functional form to fit for the relationship between transfer values and benefits. You could think about kind of keeping the linear specification, but dropping various of our arms. And what would that do to the kind of benchmark comparison and the like. And so we want to kind of think about that sensitivity. And, you should bear in mind that, when we think about from a methodological perspective, why do we do this one way versus another? I think the kind of key idea here is that we're balancing the risk of bias coming from that linear functional form being incorrect against the power losses that come from allowing more flexible functional forms where you've got kind of more parameters feeding into the comparison that you want to make and fewer degrees of, and chewing up more degrees of freedom in doing so. So here, for instance, if we look at the consumption results where we see kind of meaningful differences, this repeats what you've seen before, which is the benchmark differential in consumption. And you can see that in point estimate terms, if we allow for either a quadratic or a cubic functional form for the consequences of departures from the benchmark cost, neither of these is substantially moving the point estimate on the relative returns of cash versus kind. Similarly, we seem to be robust to the dropping of various arms. And across the board, what you see is that kind of the thought here that the linear specification is going to be the best we can do for the standard errors on the benchmark comparison seems to be borne out in data as well. So that seems for those reasons, it seems like we've landed relatively well on a kind of specification that balances the kind of power concerns without creating huge obvious biases, in spite of the fact that we're leveraging, a very large transfer, which is quite far from the kind of benchmarked cost as part of our estimation here. Okay. I think there's just about 10 more minutes, if I'm not mistaken, or is that right, or is it 20?
Yes, 10 to 20.
10 to 20. Okay, so I'll move along a little bit to show you some other kinds of things as well, and then we can discuss it at the end. Okay, so stepping back from that, thus far, I think you could say, we've sort of spoken to the trade-offs across outcomes, right? We can see the kind of relative movement on consumption and the trade-offs that invokes in terms of savings, stocks of borrowing, or other outcomes when we shift at cost equivalent levels from cash to kind. I spoke at the beginning about kind of thinking about different dimensions of trade-offs. And so, one of those dimensions of trade-offs, especially given concerns over spillovers, is about, how should we weigh the beneficiary population versus the external population? Perhaps the simplest way of doing that is to kind of weight our ineligible populations, our sampled ineligible population, to make our sample representative for the village as a whole, and think about what are village level average effects, which is one possible welfare weighting. Of course, you might want the ineligibles to enter with with weights less than 1, but this is a starting point at least. And so I think so we estimate total causal effects on the village as a whole. I think the one thing that's particularly interesting here is that in point estimate terms, when we think about, for instance, the consumption benefits of the large transfers, that not only are those kind of, not being picked up as in the recent kind of GE work in Kenya, they're not spilling over to other, in positive ways, to other households in the village. But beyond that, actually, that kind of net effect appears to be negative when we look at the total causal effect for the village. This isn't a study that's particularly kind of well set up to look specifically at spillovers, right? But it has to be that the point estimate on the ineligibles is negative. And one reason for that is that there's a bit of treatment of ineligibles in the acute career arm. But in any case, it has to be that the kind of overall effect of the large transfer is negative for the ineligibles in order to deliver this negative net point estimate on the sample as a whole. So that, I think, is one sense in which, when you think about moving to entire villages rather than kind of targeted subpopulations, your answer may differ actually in terms of kind of how this benchmarking exercise stacks up, and the relative weights of kind of the targeted individuals versus the non-targeted individuals then become important for how we think about kind of relative returns in different programs.
Okay. One question.
Yeah.
So you said at the beginning, I'm not sure I understand correctly, but there are quite a few other programs ongoing. You referred to some WASH programs and other interventions. So is there a way to link your estimates to all the exposure to other programs ongoing at the same time?
In what sense do you mean link?
So I'm wondering whether offering these transfers will have the same effect of offering them in a place where there's nothing going on to a place where there is a lot of things going on, and when people can perhaps use cash to, perhaps reduce exposure in other programs.
Yeah, I see. So it's an interesting question. I'm not sure. So I think we have some information on exposure to other programs. I think that that's pretty limited. So, one thing that the government of Rwanda does pretty effectively relative to what happens in a lot of other places is donor coordination. So, this Gikuru program kind of is the main donor sponsored activity that's happening at the grassroots level in these villages, with some coordination so that, other NGO or donor supported programs are kind of, happening in other regions or districts for the most part. So if your concern is about the possible kind of displacement of other programs, I think the scope for that is pretty limited. Most of the other things that will be happening are kind of at the meta level and are important for kind of context, but less likely to be kind of displaced by participation in this program. I guess the one exception to that maybe is the community-based health worker promotion of WASH practices, which to a lesser extent can be happening in, outside of the Gikura villages as well, given that there are community health workers in place there. I think that's not too likely to be displaced by cash, but could interact with, could be part of the context in which cash has benefits, where it does have benefits on child health outcomes. It could be because community health workers are helping to kind of, steer cash in productive directions there. So I think I would think of that mostly as important in terms of the context, and maybe one thing we ought to try to document a little bit more is the presence of community health worker interactions in the cash arms. Where I think, there's a more general version of the concern that you have is about kind of market interactions, right? So that are obviously going to mediate the consequences of cash across these contexts. And, there, I think the fact that these are in rural villages, where you might worry about price inflation as a possible mechanism by which some of the benefits fail to accrue to beneficiary households, I think is an important kind of contextual feature. The fact that the large cash does turn up in child growth outcomes, I think, tells you that at least some of this is able to stick to beneficiaries in this context. And the fact that, the consumption expenditure is in nominal terms here, right? So I think it's important to note that this negative effect here is not because of these are not real valued consumption that would reflect kind of reduced purchasing power among the ineligibles. This is kind of net reductions in expenditure that would be hard to explain by food price inflation, for instance. Okay, thanks for the question. Okay, so let me maybe focus on one other thing, and then I might skip the kind of behavioral stuff if time doesn't allow. But I think the other thing that we thought was particularly interesting was to think about heterogeneity in these relative impacts. Right? So we talked about subpopulations in terms of eligibles and ineligibles. We also look, and I won't show this to you in the interest of time, but we also look at for some defined subpopulations. So for instance, if you use particularly low child growth outcomes at baseline to define subpopulations of kind of high risk versus low risk, do we find bigger impacts? And we really don't find evidence of differential impacts on those defined populations, pre-specified kind of on a limited number of dimensions. But that doesn't preclude the possibility that there are people out there who benefit more or less from the decision to allocate in cash versus kind, and that the consequences of modality choice might be uneven in the population as a whole. And so one way that we can sort of get at this then is by thinking about trying to understand, can we model heterogeneity in the relative impacts of cash versus kind? Which we're going to do by sort of borrowing from the kind of causal forest machinery of Susan Athey and others to try to model these relative impacts in terms of a host of baseline characteristics. And so we'll do that by kind of carefully partialing out the kind of direct effects, just to look at the relative consequences of cash versus kind, and then kind of throw in a kitchen sink's worth of baseline characteristics to try to predict the relative returns to these different benefits. When we do so, to show you, for instance, right, we get out of that estimates that are consistent with pretty substantial heterogeneity in cash impacts. And so now for this part, everything is about cash relative to kind, right? And so we see pretty substantial evidence of heterogeneity across these different dimensions. I'm showing you for all of these except for the anemia one, just for purpose of space, but for across the primary outcomes, we see a fair amount of heterogeneity in these relative returns. Here, the blue lines indicate the kind of average effect of moving from cash to kind that replicates what you saw earlier in the presentation. And so, it looks like there's a fair amount of heterogeneity that could in principle be the basis of fine targeting, so that the answer to the kind of cash versus kind debate might instead be, do a bit of both based on, some observed characteristics, where first you learn about who benefits from what, and then you try to finally target. That's obviously a little bit harder to do in a cluster in a group implemented intervention than it is in an individually randomized intervention or individually implemented intervention. But you could do such an exercise restricting yourself to village level covariates as well for kind of practical constraint purposes. But there's something important here, which is that, so if you care about one outcome, let's say you only care about consumption, or you only care about height for age z-scores, or maybe the amalgamation of child growth, then I think that story is seems to be true in our data, right? That there are ways of targeting that would increase benefits one at a time. But an important caveat to that is that when we look at what is the extent of correlations in the relative, so these are rank correlations in the relative returns to the two different types of programs that I'm showing you here. The rank correlations between, and we've aggregated the child growth category to take height, wage, and MUAC together. The kind of correlations between relative returns across these different impacts are quite limited, right? So in essence, right, if what you care about is not just one of these outcomes at a time, but the some welfare function that depends on all of them or many of them, then the returns to fine targeting become much smaller. Because what turns out to be predictable to some extent based on baseline characteristics is households kind of taking cash and putting it into child growth, or putting it into immediate, so putting it into consumption today, or putting it into wealth for tomorrow, right? In some sense, actually, the most interesting of these is the negative association between the relative return of moving to cash for consumption today, if that's what you're trying to induce, versus the relative return to cash for wealth, which you might think of as kind of forward-looking households putting money into the future. Right? So that's sort of predictable, but you face a trade-off to the extent that you value both of these things. And so the broader is the set of, I think the kind of key takeaway here is that the broader is the set of stuff that you care about as a policymaker, the harder it is going to be to use fine targeting to move your welfare function here. And it's sort of, in some sense, disappointing for the fine targeting story, the extent to which relative returns to cash versus kind don't correlate very highly across dimensions, but makes sense when you think about households kind of facing a budget constraint and making economic trade-offs between those two, so that the households that invest in immediate consumption can't be the households that also have big wealth effects from cash. Okay. I think in the interest of time, let me sort of move to close. I guess to briefly summarize, when you think about the relative returns to cash versus kind, one salient feature of the difference between those two is, the possibility that, households might, for behavioral, self-control or other control reasons, or maybe just the availability of immediate investment opportunities, households might know something about, the relative returns to cash versus kind, or households might, find cash. A subset of households might find in-kind transfers useful as a way to combat the behavioral biases that might lead to kind of, blowing all the money in the very beginning. And we tackle this in a variety of ways. First of all, looking at whether kind of on average, random assignment of flow transfers versus lump sum transfers delivers better outcomes. And the answer there is that we're not actually seeing very substantial differences between the two. So for the most part, we don't see big differences between being assigned to lump sum or being assigned to flow. Secondly, we can ask whether when beneficiaries are given choice, so 1/8 of our beneficiaries are actually allocated to lump sum or flow on the basis of their own choice. And everybody, before they know whether they're in that 1/8 or not, expresses a preference over those two. Perhaps surprisingly, it is not everybody wanting the cash up front. So there's about 40% of households who prefer the flow transfer in this revealed preference exercise. But because we have those revealed preferences for everybody, we can use not just the kind of people who got their choices, but also the people who received cash and would have chosen cash if they were getting their choice, versus the people who received received flow transfers and would have chosen that. And we can think about what is the consequence of getting what you chose. There too, for this measure of kind of do households anticipate essential heterogeneity in this way? We don't see evidence that households are self-selecting into cash transfer modalities that particularly pick up their own benefits. And then finally, we can look based on some lab in the field experimental data at baseline at whether households who in that context manifest what look like self or other control problems, or particularly steep discount rates, are particularly likely to benefit from flow transfers that might force them to spread consumption over time. And there too, we don't see any evidence that these kind of behavioral attributes predict the relative returns to cash, to lump sum versus flow within the cash arm, or for that matter, to cash versus kind. Let me then sort of move to conclude by saying that, I think the sort of core of this then is that we've taken this experimental setting as a way to take kind of, flagship nutritional and health programming and try to set up an experimental framework that can be used in this context, but also in others, to perform a kind of cost equivalent benchmarking, not just comparing things on the basis of cost benefit ratios, but exactly lining things up in kind of dollars from the donor's hand terms, which we think sort of approximates the decision that donors are really confronted with a lot of the time, given fixed budgets and specific beneficiary targeted populations. And I think from this we take away that perhaps the most basic lesson here is that the ex post expenditure of about $140 per household out of the donor's hand may not be enough, or at least in the way that Gikuro was designed is not enough, but also in terms of cash, not enough to really move at least the child health outcomes over the kind of fairly short term here. But in spite of that, there are some differential effects by modality, both on consumption, but also on savings and debt reduction and other secondary outcomes. And so, a policymaker who's considering modality choice, is confronted with both the trade-offs amongst those types of outcomes at cost equivalent levels, as well as we show with the cash arm, the challenge of thinking about, is it better to do kind of modest amounts of good for large numbers of households versus try to have a bigger impact with a kind of heavier footprint, but given a fixed budget constraint, concentrate those benefits in a smaller population. And against that backdrop, the kind of returns to fine targeting seem to be modest for people who care about a lot of outcomes, not just one outcome at a time, and the kind of extent to which these interventions are leveraging or avoiding people's behavioral biases seems not, at least as far as we can measure it here, to be a really substantial concern. Maybe circling back to Katya's earlier point about kind of fears of behavioral biases and the political constraints to cash there. So that's what I wanted to say today. Thanks again for all your questions. If there's time, I more than welcome any other comments or questions.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much, Andy. So I think I'll open the floor for discussion still in the next 5 minutes or so.
So I have a question, Andrew. So I think in line with I think it was Jules that asked about previous studies on the health intervention, and I was wondering, I mean, so these type of interventions, I imagine, are I mean, there should be quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of implementation of these interventions. These are very big packages full of different modules, so I guess the complexity should be quite high. So I was wondering whether it could help to benchmark what happens in your setting in terms of, say, intermediate outcomes, like, you know, how many kits were distributed, for us to have a sense of whether, I mean, maybe this was a relatively expensive treatment, but it was, I mean, I imagine, so maybe it was not that well implemented compared to other countries or to other settings. So would you have a sense about that with your data, or so that would be my question.
Yeah, I think it's a great comment, right? And I think it's, you know, in a way it's disappointing for us, I would say, that, you know, the health intervention has smaller impacts than kind of, you know, counterpart interventions in other contexts. I think that's, you know, that's a limitation here. Even if, you know, it moves some secondary outcomes and seems to have some differential effects relative to cash, you know, we would have preferred for this to kind of be the best in class, but I suppose that's part of what, you know, what kind of, you know, these comparisons should look like in the real world in any case, and maybe, you know, some of the interventions that focused on these kinds of bundled nutritional and health interventions are smaller scale, more researcher intensive implementations with greater fidelity that lead them to have better impacts, right? So the Lancet Global Health stuff in Kenya and counterpart interventions in India, you know, may be pretty closely overseen by the researchers. So I can't speak to that definitively. I think one challenge, so I like this, you know, I think that's a challenge that we confront, and I'm really sympathetic to the spirit of your comment. I think a fundamental challenge for us is that not so much what we can say ourselves, but actually that it's rare to see a lot of kind of program implementation details in the published record on the other studies. So, you know, we have some administrative data and survey reports of kind of people's participation in the different components of the programs. Those were used for ex post costing purposes. But it's really hard to see in the, you know, in the Kenya study, in the Burundi study, there's just less information out there about kind of, you know, measures of fidelity in those other contexts. They tend to focus more on kind of going directly to the outcomes. So that's, I guess, the challenge.
Yeah. Thank you.
Andrew, can I ask a question? I'm afraid it's a bit tangential to your research question, but I was curious about the kind of general equilibrium effects within the health system, in particular inflation, a potential inflation in illicit payments. So there is a lot of anecdotal evidence and more hard evidence of the importance of illicit payments to different actors in the health system, especially doctors and nurses at the health center. Do you think that cash transfers, if perceived as an exogenous lump sum shock, could play a role in raising the level of illicit payment expected, and so having negative spillovers on the rest of the population?
It's an interesting idea. I mean, I think so. As you're alluding to, I think a lot would depend on what level of the health system we're talking about. And so, you know, I think you're thinking mostly less about kind of community health worker engagement. You would know this better than me, I think, but I suppose that's less about community health worker engagement and more about kind of, you know, farther up the kind of health infrastructure where you would expect that to be true. It would be hard for us. So, you know, of course, we can't rule out that that there are some spillovers across villages in that regard, and that's going to be hard for us to pick up. I think what we can think about is to the, you know, is that might imply negative spillovers, particularly within the village, to the extent that, you know, the people from the same village tend to access or would tend to access the same health facilities. That would tend to, that you might think that that has implications for kind of facility access in the among ineligibles within the same village, who after all are not all that wealthy either. And so we can go back and look at the sort of total causal effects versus the ITT effects on the eligibles for things like deliveries in hospital. We don't have too many other measures of engagement with the health system up the chain, but that's one that I can think of. Vaccinations, I suppose. So if we saw negative spillovers on either of those, then those might be, you know, within villages, that might be some indication of the mechanism you're thinking about. It's an interesting idea.
Thank you very much.
Okay. So I think, I mean, we are kind of over time. So thank you very much, Andy, for your very careful and detailed assessment of these different policies. It was a pleasure to have you today. We hope you come back in person very soon. And I take up the opportunity to thank everyone for being here. This was the last seminar for or webinar for the semester. So we hope to welcome everyone very soon in person for the next webinar. So thank you very much, everyone, and Andy especially. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for the great questions and for having me.